Welcome back to the Extra Literary Affairs. Today, Jennifer and I are going to have an affair with Goli Taraghi and her short story, The Encounter. So this is the first time that we've read from this author. So Goli Taraghi is an Iranian short story writer and novelist. She is one of the most critically acclaimed women writers in Iran, in fact, and she has been awarded 2 Golshiri Awards for 5 of her short stories, which helped promote her literary reputation beyond the Iranian borders. She was born in Tehran, Iran. Oh, that's hard to say. Iran in 1939. Her father was a member of parliament, a journalist, and a publisher, and was among the supporters of the modernization in Iran through founding and publishing 2 successful journals. She gained her undergraduate degree in philosophy from Drake University here in the United States. Upon returning to Iran, she got her master's degree from the University of Tehran and started to teach philosophy and the interpretation of myth and symbols. She began to publish fiction in 1969 with her short story collection, I Too Am Che Guevara. After the 1979 revolution in Iran, which caused temporary closure of universities throughout the 1980s, she moved to Paris, where she established her literary reputation and published some more of her stories translated in French. This is the first time we have read from Taraghi, and this is the second Iranian author that we have now read, the first one being Sadegh Hedayat. So we're really trying to explore different regions here, and it's a great time, and it's always fun to continue to expand our horizons.
Yeah. So Joey, thank you for reminding us that this is the second Iranian author that we have read, and I find her style to be so much different than Sadegh Hedayat. And I really was just doing the math in my head, as you said, when she was born. She was 40 years old when the Cultural Revolution took place in Iran in 1979. Hearing her background, that she was educated in the US and then she went back to her home country and lived through some of this upheaval before she abandoned that culture when she moved from Iran to Paris to perhaps pursue more intellectual and physical freedom. I think that is so reflected in the story that we picked today, The Encounter.
Yeah, and what's really interesting, sneak peek for next week, is that the story that we're going to be reading is by an Argentinian author, and in the story, the main character flees Argentina, specifically Buenos Aires, and goes to Paris. So I wonder if there is something culturally happening where, for some reason, Paris seems like the best place to self-exile. I don't know, but I guess that's a thing.
And Joey, there's a history of American authors, right? In the Gilded Age, in the Golden Age, we had Fitzgerald, we had Hemingway, we had a lot of people who were like, you know what would be great? Why don't we just hang out in Paris and see what inspiration takes us? So I am ready to join that wave, Joey. So if that opportunity comes my way, au revoir.
Bienvenue Paris. Yeah, that's true. There are American authors, like you just said. Yeah, maybe because it's like maybe it feels like a cultural mecca or something like that.
And you know who else? I think this is true. I do not think that I'm making this up. Didn't James Baldwin decide that Paris was the place for him because the United States was just inhospitable to his brilliance at that moment?
I believe yes. I think that's true. I hope it's true because we're both saying it is.
So maybe I will think of Paris as a sanctuary city where ideas go to be propagated when they are perhaps not welcome in their home country. So yeah, I love that coincidence and this beautiful writing. And speaking of coincidences, Joey, it's no coincidence that we're starting our summer stream of consciousness September with this story, because I'm really excited about how she used this style to effectively get us involved in her narrative that she created.
Okay, so now I can give us a brief summary, and we're going to switch it up. We're going to try to just come up with the summary on our own instead of getting it from somewhere and see that works. Okay, so
in our own words, Joey?
Yeah, I'm gonna see if I can do it. I think we should be able to. We read it a lot, so we could tell it back. Okay, so The Encounter by Goli Taraghi is about an unnamed woman protagonist who starts out the story in Tehran, and she sort of tells us about all these parties that she goes to and how it is strictly sort of against Islamic penal code there in Iran, obviously. And so she's kind of nervous and stuff like that. And so she gets busted. She gets busted by the 5-0, and So everyone at the party is kind of really nervous about what's going to happen because there are some very strict punishments, corporal punishment that could potentially happen, and some bribery that needs to happen as well. So as she gets to prison for her internment there, for however long they're going to keep her, one of the Revolutionary Guards, known as the Sisters, because that's the woman's side of the enforcement arm of the government, and she recognizes one of them as one of her old nannies that took care of her son, who is also unnamed but has a less than cute name. I don't think it's the greatest little chimp is what his nickname is. But anyway, so a bulk of the story is her reminiscing about her meeting this woman named Delbar and their interactions with each other as she has grown closer to her child. And there's a lot of jealousy and animosity deriving probably from classism as well. And in the end, she gets set free by this woman, Delbar, and she faces really no punishment because she was saved by this woman that she absolutely hated and fired. So I guess she had the upper hand. She had the last laugh. Okay, how is my summary?
I loved your summary, Joey, and I just have a couple of things that I would like to add. As I was reading the story, it made me think of The Handmaid's Tale and the Testaments because she is recollecting. She's like, I know it was a bad idea for me to come to this party. I had an ill feeling that something bad was going to happen, but we have to live a little. She's like, I am here to celebrate and I need to go to this party. And as she goes to the party, they get busted and like, hey, no big deal. Like, I already paid a committee member. And they're like, no, that was a different committee member. We're on the rival committee member. So everyone's going to jail. And she was like, this can't be happening. I am flying back to Paris in a week. You can't keep me here. I have a life. I need to get out of here. And the way in which the men and women are immediately broken into two separate groups. The women are chastised for not wearing their headscarves, that they are not covered. They said they forcibly were removing their makeup and their nail polish and cutting their nails. It was like, this is some serious retribution for trying to have any personal freedom. And she's like, I personally have a friend who grew up in Iran in this time and left the country about this time. And I said, well, what was it like for your sisters? Like, what was your experience? And he's like, they could go to parties. They could wear normal clothes. They could go out. They could do things. So what I recall from my friend telling me about his sister's experience is that they had immense freedom until the regime changed. And so this story felt very true to what I had heard. Now, Joey, I know this happened before you were born. As a child, I remember the Iran hostage exchange and just have some very clear thoughts of being a young child and what Iranian culture was like. So it was very interesting for me to hear this firsthand from somebody who lived through it through this author. So I really appreciated that. But the echoes to me of both the Handmaid's Tale novel and the production that they've done through the television series, there were just echoes of that they said the women that they recruited were generally people who were cast out of society. They were prostitutes. They were people who were drug addicts or had other impairments in that society that they made them lesser. And I thought, for me, Joy, and I'm so glad that you brought this up in your summary, her nanny, who she dismissed, partially because this unnamed narrator, the woman who is now in jail, was really insecure and upset that her son had bonded so much in a maternal way with her young child. And I think there were questions of class distinction. She was a divorced woman. She couldn't stay home with her child. Like, there were all of these undercurrents that were both in US culture and Iranian culture in the late 70s of like, what is a woman's place? Can you be out in the world and also be a good mom? So the big question for me, Joey, why did Delbar spare her? Why did she not take her revenge? And I was just like, how curious.
Yeah, that's a great question. We don't get an answer to that. At least the authors didn't provide it to us. So, Jennifer, why don't you start us off by telling us your initial impressions of this story?
Sure, Joey. One thing that I did want to know, this is a translation from Persian into English. So, again, we often talk about what are the word choices? Was this the word that the author initially put in here? Or were these the interpretation of the translator? Because there were several words that I was like, that's a peculiar word to stick in here. I might need to look that up, like supercilious. And I'm like,
yeah,
I don't
It was very
even,
specific.
I don't, that's not a word that would just roll off my tongue. And in thinking about the story itself, I was captured right away. She had that great voice of, I'm at a party, I'm trying to live my life. Things are different now. They're slashing women's bare legs with razors because they are
Hmm.
now enforcing all of these cover up, shut up, stay home rules. And she's like, but no. And I think this idea of being othered, of being displaced, of saying, I cannot live in the culture where I used to thrive because they don't want me here anymore, hit a little too close to my own personal feelings in this moment about what certain people are being exposed to. And so it was an emotional story from that standpoint. But the lingering question I had was about this female jealousy. So it was a male versus female sort of societal story of women once had a certain freedom in this particular society, and that was forcibly taken away. They did not vote to say, please take away my rights. My rights were taken away without the consent of the women. Okay, I understand that. That's a cultural thing. The second part, where there was like a female to female jealousy, one upmanship, who's better than who? Can you overcome this mother? Can she overcome her own insecurity and jealousy about her place in the family to allow this woman who loves her son? It's like, if you somebody loves your child, let them. Why would you
Hmm.
not? And I think there were some very beautiful moments in the story where she has that reckoning for herself of, I wish I could go back in time and let that person know how much I appreciated it. And so I'll just end my initial impressions here. At the very end of the story, when she is provided this great mercy by Delbar. And Delbar is going to get in so much trouble when they find out that she did not execute her duty by whipping this woman. There was a point in the story, they're like, why am I being let go? I didn't pay the fine and I didn't get whipped. And one of the other sisters is like, I don't know what you're talking about, but you should probably go because someone
Yeah.
is going to have to pay the price for you not getting punished. And
Hmm.
what I found interesting about that, Joey, is that she walks away from the prison, she collects her belongings, she's going to be able to catch her flight to go back to Paris to her quote unquote real life now. She can forget about what happened in Tehran because that's not her problem. She's a visitor now. That's not her culture. She's away. But she says, I wish that Delbar could be here now, today, to comfort my son because he still needs that. And so I was very conflicted about the messages in this story, and I felt they both were redeemed at the end. They both elevated their sense of justice or compassion or just self understanding to allow someone else in. So I loved this story. It's not what I expected based on the story we read a couple of weeks ago, Three Drops of Blood. That
Hmm.
really made me think this story would end up in a very different way. How about you, Joey? What was your impression of this story as you read it for the first time?
Well, it's definitely different than Sadeg Hediad. I could say that. I will agree with you there. I really like this story, and I found that it was difficult to read. And I said that about Sadeg Hediad as well, but I mean it for a different reason. The content is difficult to read here because, like you said, is an oppressive government that is in effect in control throughout Iran, and they have a morality police force that is enforcing very strict guidelines for people to adhere to. And there was some references, what are these things? What are they violating? How are these against the laws there? And because, of course, they have a government that is also including a lot of religious aspects into it, and that's why they would have a morality police. There's really no morality in government, as we could say in the United States. So I really love when stories challenge me to learn more about something that I did not know. And I think, and you touched on this a little bit when you were talking about the hostage exchange back in the 80s?
I believe it was in 1980.
19, okay. Because it's interesting how, as people of the Western world, I guess, but just people who don't live in a specific country of whatever origin that a story might be coming from, we can get really skewed ideas about what life might be like in those countries on a day to day basis, which is propaganda, propaganda. So
When we think about stereotypes, so I was 9 years old in 1980 when the hostages were released right before Ronald Reagan, or right after, it was right in the Reagan years. I thought as a child that they had to be some other culture so far removed from us, that there were no Christians there, that there was some religion I didn't understand. Again, 9-year-old person's perspective. And as I had mentioned, I have in my adult life met people who are Persian, who have come from Iran, and they both are Christians. That's how they identify. They say, we were never part of the Islamic faith. That was not us. We had the freedom to choose and decide that. And for me, I think that was a very clear stereotype as a child. I was like, no, they're all different. They can't have any choices like we have in the United States. So I think it was just very interesting, as you say, to look at the history, to talk to people who lived through this experience, to dispel my ignorance as a child, which hopefully which was able to be corrected as an adult with more experience. So I'm really glad that you took us to that point of what were the freedoms, who did get to decide what they did and did not want to do. And I think that's an important thing for us to remember as a country, based on freedom of religion. Everyone has the right to pursue their own form of happiness. What happens when those rules change? Because they had the right to live their lives the way they wanted to. And then these Islamic fundamentalists came in and overthrew the government. And Joey, I'll just end this point and I'd love to turn it back to you. When she gets taken into custody and they were scrambling around, she said, we took napkins and tablecloths. We're trying to provide the head cover because we will be beaten. We will be severely punished for not following a societal norm. And they're like, okay, we're going to make you pray. And she's like, I can't. I honestly don't know the prayers because that was not part of my tradition, and so I can't. And the final thing about what I thought the author did an amazing job with, and this again harkened back to the artistry in The Handmaid's Tale, which is not
Yeah.
that they said in order for the female guards not to get carried away in their religious fervor and beat people too hard, they would stick the Quran under their arms so they could only do it. So it was also this idea of using religion to regulate people's worst impulses physically. It just felt like an interesting tidbit for that author to put in there and make us contemplate the restraint of religion.
Yeah, I think this is a great example of why it's important to read diversely, because you just don't know what you don't know. And if you're just following what you may have learned in school or just what you were exposed to as a child, whatever era you grew up in, then you're probably missing something. You're not getting the whole story. Not probably, you're definitely missing something.
Yeah, one more thing on that, Joey. I got that information of what Iranian culture was like by reading Newsweek magazine, right, as a teenager, kind of looking back at the Iran-Contra scandal and Ali North and all of that stuff, and also television. So as we've often discussed on this podcast, we read a wide variety of cultures just to educate ourselves, but we also have a variety of people from around the world who listen to our podcast. And I can understand what it might feel like if people are judging you and I based on what they either saw on TV, on Fox News, or in a movie. Does your life look like something that's on TV, Joey? Mine certainly doesn't. But if people were saying, oh, Americans are like blank, like this thing, because that's what I saw on television, it's a reminder of how limiting, unfair, and incorrect that stereotyping can be. So thank you for letting me interject that. But I felt really strongly of, right, note to self, what you see in media may not be a complete picture or a balanced view of the humanity of another group of people. It depends on who's telling the story.
Yeah. And also take stories with a grain of salt, short story or fiction stories. So keep that in mind. Do your research, figure out, that's why I had to look up the Islamic Penal Code, because is this really what this says? Is this really, I'm not completely ignorant. I know some things, but I didn't know. I had never tried to read stuff like that, so it was important that I fill that extra gap that was left, especially because we talked about blind spots in our education, and that was one of them.
And Joey, this is a fiction story. It's not journalism, right? And so as you said, when you see a fact that is given to you in a fictional story, just check it out. Just for fun, just see, is this a hyperbole? Is this an exaggeration? Is this an exact representation of this person's truth? We may or may not know, but I think it's important to just check some facts. You don't have to take
Yeah.
everything at face value.
Yeah, and it's good to have what you just said, the distinction between journalism and fiction, because this is not meant to give us a play-by-play of an occurrence. It's not supposed to be a collection of objective fact. This is supposed to make us feel something and gain empathy and see what it might be like to live in Tehran at the moment that that was written, and what it would be like to experience those things. So, but moving on. One of my favorite themes of the story, and you brought this up at the beginning as well, is motherhood, and how the unnamed protagonist, what the dynamic between the unnamed protagonist and her unnamed child, also significant, which you say this a lot, Jennifer, that if someone is unnamed, it's important who is named and who is unnamed. And Delbar is really one of the only named people other than Mr. and Mrs. M. And we, of course, there is supposed to be some distance between us because we don't get to know their real name. But Delbar is an important character because she is named. So keep an eye out for that when you're reading fiction.
So, Joey, I appreciate that you remind us that certain individuals in the story are unnamed. And Little Chimp is her child that is given to her child by Delbar, who is the nanny who was hired. And when he was first given that name, the mom was like, I don't like this name, but she's like, all these years later, I still use it. So there was a renaming, a reclaiming of your child by giving a name, naming a child. I have not had the honor of doing that, but that's kind of a big responsibility. The reason, Joey, I think that our narrator is not named is that this is a stream of consciousness story. So we are in her head. She doesn't have to say, and Jennifer said, she just says, I'm thinking this, and we are fucked. We are placed immediately into her internal dialogue, her internal thought process. She, in some ways, doesn't need to be named because she's not being addressed directly from someone outside of our perspective. Joey, what did you think about that?
Yeah, I think it's our Stream of Consciousness September. So that is important to note because these stories are selected specifically because of that. And just to give us an exact definition of what stream of consciousness is, because it's something that does come up in literature a lot, and so but sometimes it might be hard for people to identify what exactly does it look like. According to litcharts.com, stream of consciousness is a literary technique that aims to represent the flow of a character's thoughts and feelings in a continuous, often unpunctuated manner. It originated in psychology and is used primarily in fiction and poetry to depict the inner workings of a character's mind, capturing a range of impressions, visual, auditory, and emotional. This narrative style allows readers to experience the character's thoughts as they occur, often blending rational thought with sensory experience, which is basically what you just said, but just a little bit more succinct. There's a lot of authors who are very famous for stream of consciousness. Virginia Woolf is probably the one that a lot of people would think of when they think of stream of consciousness. And as we go through September here, each story will get more and more difficult with stream of consciousness. And James Joyce is, of course, coming into play here. So it'll be interesting to follow that.
Joey, I believe that you said to our audience that as we go forward with Stream of Consciousness September, that we would be tackling stories sort of from a entry level position, and as time progressed and we discussed them together, they will become more complex. And I think one of the great things you've said, not just recently, but in our entire podcast experience, is that stream of consciousness may appear, if you're reading it quickly, to be a bunch of jumbled up thoughts that make no sense. You're talking about a cat, and then you're talking about a box, and then you're talking about your lunch, and then you remember the color purple, and you're just bouncing all over the place. Now, that is perhaps an unskilled way that an author can it's like they're not just throwing things to the wall and seeing what sticks. As you slow down, as you get to know these characters and can anticipate the way in which they are seeing the world. You said that to me at one point. You're like, these characters, you know them so well that when somebody says something and it's not punctuated and you don't know who's saying it, you're like, oh, I know exactly who said that, because that's the kind of thing that person would say. So, Joey, I just think you have said that so beautifully in previous episodes, that be patient with yourself and others as you're going through stream of consciousness, because it may seem jumbled, but the more you do it, the more you're like, I get it. It's like all these little fragments in their head. Instead of sorting them in a nice sentence and a nice little structure and telling the story from point A to point B, they just let it rip. And then you can reassemble the puzzle pieces yourself and be like, That's what she was trying to say.
I wanted to read just the opening paragraph to this story just so that everyone gets an idea of like what style of stream of consciousness is this, because as you just said, we're starting at sort of entry level. Not to knock this author, she did a great job, and it's not that you have to write stream of consciousness in a very complex Virginia Woolf, James Joyce, T.S. Eliot kind of sense. You can do it however you want, and I think this story is very easy to follow. It sort of feels like a conversation more, that the protagonist is sort of just reminiscing and is retelling us her story. So I'll just read that paragraph. I have a feeling that it is a mistake to go to the party at Mr. M's, especially under the circumstances. Things have tightened up once more. Again, scarves have to be pulled down all the way to the eyebrows and legs covered in thick black stockings. Again, the loose-fitting, ankle-length smocks have to be worn. They are once again slashing women's bare legs with razors and shaving the heads of young boys or publicly flogging them in city squares, and yet no one is really scared or chastised into full conformity. To hang out, harangue, eat, and drink are requisite conditions of survival. Something the desperate have to do, since for them the world is on its last leg, about to collapse in a day or two. So let's live to the fullest, they say. The less fatalistic ones, on the other hand, take cover underground, listen to foreign radio broadcasts, and await the triumphant return of the young king from abroad. So hopefully that gave us a sense of, this is a very simplistic way of doing stream of consciousness, and you'll see if you're listening along as we read all of these, it's going to get harder and harder to follow, ending with Clarice Lispector, who, woof, that one is hard to follow sometimes. I don't know, between her and James Joyce, I'm not really sure who's the harder one to read.
So, Joey, before we switch back to motherhood, because I think that is central to this story, I do want to echo what you said about there are various ways that authors can deploy stream of consciousness to be the start of the story that you just read to me felt very natural. It felt very in keeping with things I could understand. I didn't have to be challenged. I did have to ask a few questions of like, wait, why were their heads getting shaved? What do you mean by going underground? Like, there was just a lot of questions that came up exactly as you said. If I was having a conversation with someone and they just mentioned these things, I'm going to have the same questions, be like, oh wait, I have some notes. I have some questions. Can you please help me answer this question? And Joey, what was particularly interesting when we circle back to motherhood, I believe my misconceptions or my understanding currently about the Islamic State, that women are perhaps not prized, that it is not a matriarch. It is a patriarch where women are put in a specific category and deemed property of their family. There's a lot that goes around with that. So when I was thinking about the story of motherhood, that this one was kind of breaking a little bit of that mold. She had possession of her child. Her ex-husband was absent from the scene. We don't know what happened to him. Is he a political prisoner? Did he just go? Nobody knows. Is this also the idea of Iran taking care of its people? Is Iran trying to be the mother for this society and trying to guide them? Or is this a different type of setup? This just really plucked my strings, Joey, in thinking about who is in charge of informing others and themselves about humanity. Because at one point, when the women were all dropped off at the detention center before they were going to receive their punishment, there are old women there. And one lady said, I need to use the bathroom. And she's like, well, you're going to have to hold it. This isn't a public toilet. And she's like, watch yourself, girl. I'm old enough to be your mom. Can't you show me some respect? So again, there's these age dynamics, respect, and she's like, don't speak to me because you were here. If you were a real woman, you wouldn't be out and about cavorting in the streets as you were. Like, there was just this very strong moral overtone of the guard saying, you got what you deserved. And there was a mother with a small infant child with her, because the mothers and children went together in this internment camp, for lack of a better word. And they're like, can you give me special consideration? I need to nurse my child. And she's like, you should have thought of that. You should have been home. You wouldn't even be here if you were being a good mom. So there's those little story lines interwoven into the story that I'm like, how curious.
Yeah, it's also interesting because, as you were saying, the interaction between the guards or the sisters and the prisoners is that there is this sense of superiority. Like, you wouldn't, as you just said, you wouldn't be here if you were the correct type of woman or you had the correct behaviors. So, but it's interesting because in the very beginning you also noted that these women, at least in the story, are said to be sort of reformed of their sin and were sex workers or whatever type of addict to whatever type of substance. And so they would have at one time been considered immoral. And now they have the high ground. So it's interesting that they at one time were persecuted for whatever the reason was, and now they get to be the persecutors. So I think that's an interesting dynamic. I don't know how true that is. I don't know if that's how it works in Iran. I will have to look that up. But I think that's an interesting dynamic. And I think that probably lends to why Delbar lets her go, as you asked that question in the very beginning. Without punishment, why does she let her go? Because I think maybe Delbar sees that she's not morally superior to these other women that she's now overseeing, and that they're not really doing very much wrong going to a party and not wearing the correct veil or hijab or burqa or whatever the code says that they need to wear. Not such a great crime after all.
And Joey, I appreciate you say that, because one of the things that came up for me as you were describing that, there's also, it's not faceless when she sees someone from her past and she is now in charge. She's now the moral high ground through whatever circumstance. Because I think very early in the story, our unnamed protagonist says, oh, Delbar, I know her. I can smell her essence, right? She could smell her. She's like, I know that person. I know that smirk. I know her from the past. And I think there was a ripple of fear in the protagonist when she did that. She's like, I didn't let her say goodbye to my son. I fired her because I was jealous. Delbar said to her, our paths will meet again. You just wait and see. And again, so for me, it felt a little bit, we talked several episodes ago about what foreshadowing is. Right in that first paragraph, she said, I had a bad feeling about going to this party, but I realized I need to live my life. And when Delmar says, you think you are done with me, but I know someday, some way, our paths will cross again. The protagonist, who is now in jail, is not a faceless stranger. She's not an other. She is not some person. She has a personal relationship with Delbar. And Delbar, I think, models that. It was like, I don't just see you as my enemy. I see you as a person, and I understand you. And therefore, I love that she said you had to take your shoes off. They would lay you on a bed and they would strike you with the whip over your clothing as your form of punishment. But she's like, but you have to take your shoes off. And she's like, why? Why? Okay, I'm taking my shoes off. And she said, instead of being, she's, laying there thinking, oh, it's going to happen. It's going to happen. Okay, I'm really, really scared. And she says she sort of just tickles the bottom of her foot. She has this like little light tapping. She's like, wait, this cannot be my punishment. And then it ends. And she said the fear of torture was her true torture. And I think that's an interesting concept for us to just think about. The apprehension of what may happen to you may be more terrifying and more damaging than the actual physical act. Joey, so I just thought that was so interesting, subtly letting us know that when you can acknowledge someone else's humanity by their scent, by their smirk, by the way she stands, she's like, I saw her standing in a certain way, and her body language is like, oh my God, I know that person. It's been 20 years, but I know you. And I just thought that the humanity coming through was a nice reminder for us that we're all in this together, whether we think we are the correct ones or we are the people who are in the wrong ones who are just trying to live our lives.
Yeah. And it's interesting because prior to the revolution in Iran, according to this story, I have to caveat that because I don't know if it's true or not, or how true it is. I'm sure there is truth in it. There seems to be some serious class divides, but it would appear from the story that those sort of get erased a little bit, or there's an upward trajectory is possible now if you were to repent from your wicked ways and become part of this morality police force. Because in the beginning, when she goes through this slew of different nannies trying to find the right one. One drugs her son with opium to keep him quiet at night. And I was like, oh my God, Jesus Christ.
You're out.
Yeah, obviously, you're not in here. But when she first meets Delbar is very sort of rebellious, and she doesn't quite know her societal place. And our unnamed protagonist is kind of put off by that, but also sort of intrigued and sort of is like not really sure what to do with this woman, but she senses like this is probably the correct choice for her son, but she's like, but you're not acting correctly. And I'll just read one quote from the story. She sounded arrogant and abrasive, as if she did not care if she was hired or not. Deep down, I resented her attitude. I was thinking I could humiliate her and put her in her place by firing her after 2 days. So we understand that Delbar is missing something, as she's not getting a societal norm. She's breaking it by not being more respectful to this unnamed protagonist who wants to employ her.
Joey, my mom would say that Delbar was uncouth, right? She didn't have social graces. That's a word my mom would have used. But what was interesting in the passage that you just read, we don't get a good, I do not get a good feeling about the protagonist who said, I will humiliate her in 2 days for not following the social norms that I put in place for her. Because I'm like, well, let's just flip the script 20 years from now when Delbar is in a place where she could have inflicted some revenge. She was like, I won't. So there's this internal tension for me in looking at the story. We think the professional businesswoman who has the child and has this great life and is being rebellious, not following society's norms, but kind of not, is now reflected to Delbar, who is told that, oh, you are othered, you are disposable, you're not an important person. It's like, well, I'm important enough and I'm the only person who's going to watch your kids, so maybe I have more power than you think. That we sort of get a feeling that Delbar is, I don't want to say morally superior because I hate those words, but has perhaps a more nuanced understanding of human beings and their inherent value. And she's not going to inflict any malicious intent. And Joey, I think that's so important. This just came to me. That protagonist said, I am going to destroy you. But she's like, I'm just going to hire you. So 2 days later, I can fire you for being insolent. I'm just going to do that. And that's not great. Like, that is not, I wouldn't want somebody to know that about me. I would not want that to be what somebody believed. And so this author shows us that this lower person who's working this menial job actually has a better, perhaps, moral compass than the person who was out in society winning.
It's interesting to compare these two characters, the unnamed protagonist and Delbar, because we can see an opportunity that Delbar has in the end to seek revenge or vengeance against the unnamed protagonist. And when she has all of the power in this relationship, and power dynamics is something that we talk about often, is how does she treat that power? How does she interact with that power? Uses it responsibly, I would say. If she does not give out the punishment that she is supposed to be doing, it's literally her job, and she's supposed to be upholding the law, even if she doesn't agree with it. But she chooses not to. Whereas the unnamed protagonist has all the power at this point in this part of the story and chooses to use it against Delbar. And in the end, she does fire her because of her jealousy. Is that the correct way to use your power when you have this person's livelihood? And in Delbar, eventually it says, like, I'll do this for free. I genuinely love your son. He is very special to me. They bonded. As the unnamed protagonist's son gets sick with the flu, but she also has the flu, and Delbar is the only one who can take care of anyone. So and that seems to be the point that she really bonds with the kid, because she was able to take care of him and sort of be there and be very caring, whereas the protagonist doesn't seem to be very nurturing or caring. And that's not to say that she's not still a good woman, that would be something that someone might knock, but we can see how difficult it would probably be to be an unmarried woman who has like a demanding job and a son. You can only do so much in a day.
For taking us there, Joey, about who is doing the mothering. The fact that Delbar can say, you are ill, protagonist. Like, go back to bed. Nobody's going to die here. I've seen this before. Let me handle it. And there is power in that. But there's also mercy and this sort of universal feminine energy, healing energy of, this is not my child for circumstances we don't know about. We don't know what Delbar is thinking. We don't know. But she, in the story, isn't married, doesn't have a child, may not have family relationships, that she's able to fulfill that role, that instinctual caretaking that she has for both of them. And the mom, although grateful, resents it bitterly. And I was like, Joey, that's strike two. One, you say, I'm going to punish you for not following society's rules. So, like, I'm going to be the punisher because I'm superior to you. And second, I'm just going to be a petty, jealous little person who's like, oh my goodness, my son loves you. Therefore, I'm going to get displaced. So you got to go. I was like, okay, two strikes, you're out, lady. Like, you are not being seen in the best light from my Western perspective.
Yeah. And I think this story sort of reminded me of The Paper Menagerie by Ken Liu, because in the end, the unnamed child sort of loses part of his identity as an Iranian person, or from the Iranian culture, because he's grown up in Paris, and the plan was sort of to come back in a year or so when this all blew over. Of course, it did not, and we're in the year of our Lord 2025. So, that wasn't a good plan. But so he really loses part of his own identity and culture, and it's something that, and they obviously go back and visit, and the author herself also does that. In that story, that the protagonist also loses part of his culture and identity, and it ends up being something that was really important to him as an adult. So that made me think, in this story, what happens after the story is done? Is this something that her son learns to sort of, I can't really have regret because he didn't have a choice, but something that he sort of mourns is that loss of his part of his identity, because he certainly mourns the loss of Delbar, and this, it's not really his mother, this caretaker who's very nurturing. So unfortunately, this kid has a lot of loss in this story.
Through no fault of his own, which also reflects, there's a young Afghani boy who was in the story at the party, and they said that he was in their country illegally. He was seized as part of this raid that the Revolutionary Guard came to enforce their moral code. And now that boy, they said he's going to be deported back to Afghanistan and probably murdered. Like they say.
Actually, they said skinned alive.
Yeah, I just couldn't say that, Joey. But yes, he is going to be skinned alive. And I think that was also just a very interesting commentary on what happens in these broad sweeps. People who are just trying to better their lives are swept up, return to their country of origin, and may meet their death in a very gruesome and brutal way. There's probably a very valid reason for why he escaped. And now it's like, no, these are the rules. Everyone's getting deported. If you are not from here, you are not from here. You are not welcome. And Joy, I love that you took us to The Paper Menagerie, because that was all about this mothering spirit and how you honor that. And it, as you were talking, it just made me wonder if when the son, if he ever ran into Delbar somewhere out, if he would notice, if he would hear her laugh, he would smell her scent, he would see how she was standing, and just have that instant recognition of like, this is a person who loved me and I still love. And I think back to people who have culturally grown up with nannies because their parents were choosing that as the way. I'm like, I'll be very careful here, that grew up with nannies whose family structure included extra helpers, and the very deep attachments that they had for the person who nurses you when you're sick, the person who cuts the bread crust off your sandwich, the person who knows that you like the blue cup and not the pink cup, and the, all of these little details that we traditionally think about caregivers. What makes you a mother? What makes you a caregiver? What makes you a person who matters? And it's like, well, if you can love and care for yourself and others, there's some validity in that, regardless of your status in that particular society or with those particular family members.
Motherhood comes in lots of different flavors. It doesn't all have to look the same. I'm sure this woman, this unnamed protagonist, loves her son very much. She was jealous. She loved him enough to be so jealous that she fired the person that he really loves the most and feels most comfortable with. But yeah, I think that's a good point, that it's a good depiction of motherhood, because it doesn't always have to look so stereotypical, where you have to be like this literally perfect woman to dedicate your life to your family. Not that you shouldn't dedicate some of your time, but I appreciate that there's a different perspective on how motherhood could potentially look. Next week, we're going to be reading a story called Half a Race by Juan Jose Sayer. And it's another stream of consciousness story that talks about some political upheaval. So I think we're going to see the common thread, the through line here. And it's a little bit more complicated of a stream of consciousness stories. And then we're going to go to Joyce. So buckle up, y'all.
Looking forward to it, Joey. We'll see you next week.